So there's a few options you have for home practice, and in home practice, one of the things that's really useful is to set yourself an objective, let's say. So you're coming out of here, and you're going, wow, there was a lot to release. I want to do more release. So then you have to decide. So let's say you say, okay, I'm going to spend the next month or so really exploring what there is to release. So then you look at your life, so to speak, right? And you go, when do I have time for longer sessions? Or do I have time for longer sessions? And if the answer is yes, right, then you could say, okay, well, I'm going to do a few longer sessions where I give myself the time and the space to really go there. And then the rest of the day, the rest of the time, I'm flossing, so to speak, right? So what I mean by flossing, of course, is short practice that kind of gets the body into the habit of kind of catching up with what's happening. So that could be just 10 minutes, 5 minutes even. Many of you know this because I talk about it. I tend to do a quick nonlinear session under the shower every time I have to wait for my conditioner to soak in. Because I'm just standing there, and that's a good moment to kind of check in with my body. And then, of course, that's not all you do, but flossing is one way to give the body a chance to work through things in a less intense way. And then when you say, let's say, for instance, you have twice a week, if you really want to explore, where you can do an hour, then what you'll do is you'll make yourself a playlist, and you just set, what I do typically is I make a playlist that ends with a relaxation song, and then I know I'm done, because sometimes on Spotify stuff continues to play, which has happened to me, where, you're like, wow, this is a long session, and I don't recognize the music, and it's like you're like way far down in the suggestion thing, right? So I use the same song for relaxation all the time in teaching as well for myself, so that I know that that's the end, and then I know when that song's over, I'll get up. So, and then you'll just let that happen, and you'll let whatever happens. What's optimal if you want to work with release is that you have some time after where you can either take a bath, a shower, a cold dip, a swim. The more water, the better. If you don't have a cold dip, a swim, or a bath available, what you can do is you can get into the shower, and you can kind of point the shower head on your forehead, and then just let it run down, and kind of imagine even that everything gets washed down into the drain, and then leave it at that. Yeah, you always want to have a formal end to the practice. That's very, very important, because when you do that, then you're essentially letting the body know it's over as well. So yeah, it's a good question and a very timely question, because in recent years, the research has gone towards what is called epigenetic trauma, right? And it used to be that people thought, for instance, that there's some genetic stuff that is like health-wise, let's say, or behavior-wise, but it wasn't considered that the information of, let's say, your mother or grandmother was really transmitted, so to speak. But now we know that it actually is, right? And so on an epigenetic level, the trauma of our ancestors is passed down not through the genome, but through the epigenome, which is a series of methylated chains, I think it's called. Yes. I'm looking at Mark, who's a world-class scientist, by the way, if you are wondering who's washing your dishes. So methylated chains, my brain not so good in this heat. And these methylated chains turn on and off gene expression. So I'm telling you this only for the reason that there's a lot of research done on this now. And one of the things they found, which I think is no surprise to anyone who's engaged in that inquiry, is that essentially all the things that are done in the shamanic realms actually have an influence on the epigenome, which is kind of interesting. So things that have an influence on the epigenome are rhythmic dancing, drumming, smudging, plant medicines, ritual, certain kind of healing methods that are done in indigenous cultures, the taking of things, that, like all of that stuff actually has an impact on the epigenome, meaning you can change the way gene expression happens through these external things. You can also do things, nowadays we know that, right? You can do certain treatments in the somatic realm, right? And you can do now, of course, the reason they're researching this is because they want to find drugs. Because drugs they can patent and then they can make money. You can't make a lot of money from, mushroom journeys. But you can make money if you find drugs. So there's a lot of research done on that, on, kind of essentially creating drugs that get that trauma and the epigenetic information shifted. But the tried and true ancient ways, interestingly, work very well. So knowing that and knowing that you can, is kind of an interesting thing from a, let's say, scientific standpoint. As far as a procedural standpoint, there's a few things to consider. One of which is that you are absolutely right. There's some really interesting stuff that can happen when you alter your perception on something. Right? So, for instance, you don't mind me saying that, right? When we talked yesterday with Nicola about her mother, she came out of the session and her mother had sent her a text, a very loving text, right? And then she came out of the evening session when her daughter said the very words that she had in her praise to her in a text. Well, why is that? Because, of course, we're all connected as humans, but particularly in a family line, the people who've given birth to you or the people who are related to you can feel you. There's all kinds of webs and connections that are not, scientifically apparent or medically apparent, but they're there. And so you can inform your line going backwards by your actions or by the shift in your patterns. And there's a thing we do on occasion called Lineage and Liberation, where we specifically work with liberating the lineage. So you can do it, and I think it's a worthwhile thing to work on. This often comes up in context of, like, let's say, nonlinear teacher training and stuff like that, where people go, I don't want to become more sensitive, because we're sensitizing, right? And then that's a conversation that's often had. How sensitive is too sensitive, and how do you deal with being highly sensitive, right? And so there is many reasons why somebody could be sensitive, one of which is, of course, trauma. Right. Another one is overload. Right. Is meaning your system isn't capable of handling the input that is presented for whatever reason. That could be trauma, but it could also just be the way you're built. Right. We know that certain people that are now called neurodivergent, right? Now everything has a nice label because it also makes it so much easier to sell things to people, medications, books, whatever. Everything's got the label now. But when you really look at it, there's people who just, their nervous systems are built differently. It's not trauma, it's just they are not built like the next person. For whatever reason. There's a whole study that just came out that I just read a couple of weeks ago where they now can trace neurotransmitters in the mother, so whatever happens in the mother's body while a child is being grown with certain behavior traits in the child. And it was these groups, the dopamine, responses, the serotonin responses, and how that forms a baby's brain. And we've kind of known that, but just by saying, "Oh, don't be stressed when you're pregnant," or things, or "Don't eat these things; they do stuff to your body." But now we're able to actually link that with certain brain developments, and there's specific times within pregnancy where that brain development is very important. That moment of the brain developing, where more can go right or wrong. So there's now an assumption that there's a certain kind of influence on neurodivergence and sensitivity in those areas as well. So you don't know what it is, and it's, I think, neither a gift nor a curse in the context of learning how to manage it. The problem that's often happening when people are called highly sensitive person, is that gives them the permission to pack themselves in cotton wool, so to speak, and then it gets worse because, of course, when you no longer have exposure to certain things, your world gets smaller and smaller, you experience more and more narrow, and then you're less likely or able to be actually going out into, let's say, an underground, or driving with, going to work in the underground or so, because you're not capable of that. So while it's good to be sensitive, the sensitivity has to be worked within the context of resilience. And so, of course, when we look at trauma therapy, we look at building resilience through a variety of factors that allow the person to actually face the stimulus and not get thrown out or kind of popped out by it. And there's a certain amount of having to learn how to feel below the sensitivity, which is essentially a kind of pulling away from the feeling into feeling and accepting and turning towards the unpleasant feeling. So I personally think that people who, kind of enable the highly sensitive person to have a narrower and narrower experience are really doing some harm, because what's left then? You stay home, right? It is considered that children are much more highly sensitive, not necessarily because they're more traumatized or because they're born as these special creatures, but it has to do with the early exposure to electronics. Right? I was in the airport somewhere recently. It's really shocking. Oh yeah, in LA at the airport. I walked into the airport, toilet there, and they have like a big changing table now, really nice, not like that. You're leaning over some toilet, some horrible situation. And there was a mother changing a baby, so not super, super small, but small enough to still need diapers. And she's changing the kid, and the kid was holding an iPhone, watching something, and like swiping, right? So we're talking, under 2, essentially. And that's considered one of the reasons why brains are not wiring the way they should be, and where there's no physical activity and a lot of mental activity, and the massive overexposure does something that allows the body to not cope. So there's all of that. We could say that's a trauma, but maybe that's just really bad, exposure or things like that. So I'd say not all hypersensitivity is trauma, but I think the first place you would look when you have somebody who's hypersensitive is areas of trauma. Yeah. That I think would be the first boxes to tick, are the physical traumas, emotional traumas, and so on and so on. I wouldn't want to say do this or do that, but there's lots and lots of research and literature on that. I'm happy to point you towards a few sources where there's some real research on what happens in brain development when you park your child in front of a TV for as a babysitter and things like that. So there's real data out there, and there's also lots of people trying to make a difference in that way. And I think the universally accepted best practice is the less the better, particularly in those, really formative years. And then also where it can't be helped, because it's in the schools, it's everywhere. I heard the other day that they now estimate that only about 10 to 12% of all second graders know how to write by hand. And there you see how things can really go wrong. Yeah. So there is lots of literature on that, and you can read all the things. But what I was going to say is how you counteract it later is by lots of outside activity. It's now researched that children being able to go outside, have long view eye movement, so looking further away, seeing large vistas and things like that has a huge effect on brain development.